The Age of Reason, being an investigation of true and fabulous theology, is a work written by English and American political activist Thomas Paine. It follows in the tradition of 18th-century British deism, and challenges institutionalized religion and the legitimacy of the Bible. Originally distributed as unbound pamphlets, it was published in 3 parts in 1794, 1795, and 1807. It was a bestseller in the United States, where it caused a short-lived deistic revival. British audiences, however, fearing increased political radicalism as a result of the French Revolution, received it with more hostility. The Age of Reason presents common deistic arguments. For example, it highlights what Paine saw as corruption of the Christian Church and criticizes its efforts to acquire political power. Paine advocates reason in the place of revelation, leading him to reject miracles and to view the Bible as an ordinary piece of literature rather than as a divinely inspired text. It promotes natural religion and argues for the existence of a creator God. Most of Paine's arguments had long been available to the educated elite, but by presenting them in an engaging and irreverent style, he made deism appealing and accessible to a mass audience. The book was also inexpensive, putting it within the reach of a large number of buyers, fearing the spread of what they viewed as potentially revolutionary ideas. The British government prosecuted printers and booksellers who tried to publish and distribute it. Nevertheless, Paine's work inspired and guided many free thinkers. Historical context. Intellectual context. 18th-century British deism. Paine's book followed in the tradition of early 18th-century British deism. These deists, while maintaining individual positions, still shared several sets of assumptions and arguments that Paine articulated in The Age of Reason. The most important position that united the early deists was the call for free rational inquiry into all subjects, especially religion, saying that early Christianity was founded on freedom of conscience. They demanded religious toleration and an end to religious persecution. They also demanded that debate rest on reason and rationality. Deists embraced a Newtonian worldview, and they believed all things in the universe, even God, must obey the laws of nature. Without a concept of natural law, the deists argued explanations of the workings of nature would descend into irrationality. This belief in natural law drove the skepticism of miracles, because miracles had to be observed to be validated. Deists rejected the accounts laid out in the Bible of God's miracles and argued that such evidence was neither sufficient nor necessary to prove the existence of God. Along these lines, deistic writings insisted that God, as the first cause, a prime mover, had created and designed the universe with natural laws as part of his plan. They held that God does not repeatedly alter his plan by suspending natural laws to intervene in human affairs. Deists also rejected the claim that there was only one revealed religious truth or one true faith. Religion could only be simple, apparent, ordinary, and universal if it was to be the logical product of a benevolent God. They therefore distinguished between revealed religions, such as Christianity, and natural religion, a set of universal beliefs derived from the natural world that demonstrated God's existence. While some deists accepted revelation, most argued that revelation's restriction to small groups, or even a single person, limited its explanatory power. Moreover, many found the Christian revelations in particular to be contradictory and irreconcilable. According to these writers, revelation could reinforce the evidence for God's existence already apparent in the natural world, but more often it led to superstition among the masses. Most deists argued that priests had deliberately corrupted Christianity for their own gain by promoting the acceptance of miracles, unnecessary rituals, and illogical and dangerous doctrines. The worst of these doctrines was original sin. By convincing people that they required a priest's help to overcome their innate sinfulness, deists argued, religious leaders had enslaved the human population. Deists therefore typically viewed themselves as intellectual liberators. Political context. French Revolution. By the time Part 1 of The Age of Reason was published in 1794, many British and French citizens had become disillusioned by the French Revolution. The Reign of Terror had begun. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had been tried and executed, and Britain was at war with France. Those few British radicals who still supported the French Revolution and its ideals were viewed with deep suspicion by the countrymen. The Age of Reason belongs to this later, more radical stage of the British political reform movement, one that openly embraced republicanism and atheism, and is exemplified by such texts as William Godwin's Political Justice. By the middle of the decade, the moderate voices had disappeared. Richard Price, the dissenting minister whose sermon on political liberty had prompted Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France, had died in 1791, and Joseph Priestley had been forced to flee to America after a Church and King mob burned down his home and church. The conservative government, headed by William Pitt, responded to this increasing radicalization by prosecuting several reformers for seditious libel and treason in the famous 1794 treason trials. Following the trials and an attack on George III, conservatives were successful in passing the Seditious Meetings Act and the Treasonable Practices Act. These acts prohibited freedom of assembly for groups such as the Radical London Corresponding Society and encouraged indictments against radicals for libelous and seditious statements. Afraid of prosecution and disenchanted with the French Revolution, many reformers drifted away from the cause. The LCS, which had previously unified religious dissenters and political reformers, fractured when Francis Place and other leaders helped Paine publish The Age of Reason. The Society's more religious members withdrew in protest, and the LCS lost around one-fifth of its membership. Publishing history. In December 1792, Paine's Rights of Man, Part 2 was declared seditious in Britain, and he was forced to flee to France in order to avoid arrest. Dismayed by the French Revolution's turn toward secularism and atheism, he composed Part 1 of The Age of Reason in 1792 and 1793. It has been my intention for several years past to publish my thoughts upon religion. The circumstance that has now taken place in France of the total abolition of the whole national order of priesthood, and of everything appertaining to compulsive systems of religion and compulsive articles of faith, has not only precipitated my intention, but rendered a work of this kind exceedingly necessary, lest in the general wreck of superstition, of false systems of government and false theology, we lose sight of morality, of humanity, and of the theology that is true. Although Paine wrote The Age of Reason for the French, he dedicated it to his fellow citizens of the United States of America, alluding to his bond with the American revolutionaries. It is unclear when exactly Paine drafted Part 1, although he says in the preface to Part 2, conceiving that I had but a few days of liberty, I sat down and brought the work to a close as speedily as possible, and I had not finished it more than 6 hours. In the state it has since appeared, before a guard came there, about 3 in the morning, with an order for putting me in arrestation as a foreigner, and conveying me to the prison of the Luxembourg. I contrived, in my way there, to call on Joel Barlow, and I put the manuscript of the work into his hands. According to Paine scholars Edward Davidson and William Schaik, he probably wrote the first draft of Part 1 in late 1793, but Paine biographer David Hawke argues for a date of early 1793. It is also unclear whether or not a French edition of Part 1 was published in 1793. François Lanthenaz, who translated The Age of Reason into French in 1794, wrote that it was first published in France in 1793, but no book fitting his description has been positively identified. Barlow published the first English edition of The Age of Reason, Part 1 in 1794 in London, selling it for a mere 3p. Meanwhile, Paine, considered too moderate by the powerful Jacobin wing of the French revolutionaries, was imprisoned for 10 months in France. He only escaped the guillotine by accident. The sign marking him out for execution was improperly placed on his cell door. When James Monroe, at the time the new American minister to France, secured his release in 1794, Paine immediately began work on Part 2 of The Age of Reason, despite his poor health. Part 2 was first published in a pirated edition by H. D. Symonds in London in October 1795. In 1796 Daniel Isaac Eaton published Parts 1 and 2, and sold them at a cost of 1 shilling and 6p. Paine himself financed the shipping of 15,000 copies of his work to America. Later, Francis Place and Thomas Williams collaborated on an edition which sold about 2,000 copies. Williams also produced his own edition, but the British government indicted him and confiscated the pamphlets. In the late 1790s, Paine fled from France to the United States, where he wrote Part 3 of The Age of Reason, an examination of the passages in the New Testament quoted from the Old and called prophecies concerning Jesus Christ, fearing unpleasant and even violent reprisals. Thomas Jefferson convinced him not to publish it in 1802. 5 years later, Paine decided to publish, despite the backlash he knew would ensue. Following Thomas Williams's sentence of 1 year's hard labor for publishing The Age of Reason in 1797, no editions were sold openly in Britain until 1818, when Richard Carlile included it in an edition of Paine's complete works. Carlile charged 1 shilling and 6p for the work, and the first run of 1,000 copies sold out in a month. He immediately published a second edition of 3,000 copies. Like Williams, he was prosecuted for seditious libel and blasphemous libel. The prosecutions surrounding the printing of The Age of Reason in Britain continued for 30 years after its initial release and encompassed numerous publishers as well as over 100 booksellers. Structure and major arguments. The Age of Reason is divided into 3 sections. In Part 1, Paine outlines his major arguments and personal creed. In Parts 2 and 3, he analyzes specific portions of the Bible in order to demonstrate that it is not the revealed Word of God. Analysis. At the beginning of Part 1 of The Age of Reason, Paine lays out his personal belief. I believe in one God, and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy. But, lest it should be supposed that I believe many other things in addition to these, I shall, in the progress of this work, declare the things I do not believe, and my reasons for not believing them. I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish Church, by the Roman Church, by the Greek Church, by the Turkish Church, by the Protestant Church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church. All national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian or Turkish, appear to me no other than human inventions, set up to terrify and enslave mankind, and monopolize power and profit. I do not mean by this declaration to condemn those who believe otherwise. They have the same right to the belief as I have to mine. but it is necessary to the happiness of man that he be mentally faithful to himself. Infidelity does not consist in believing, or in disbelieving, it consists in professing to believe what he does not believe. Paine's creed encapsulates many of the major themes of the rest of his text: a firm belief in a creator God, a skepticism regarding most supernatural claims, a conviction that virtues should be derived from a consideration for others rather than oneself, an animus against corrupt religious institutions, and an emphasis on the individual's right of conscience. Reason and revelation. Paine begins the Age of Reason by attacking revelation. Revelation, he maintains, can only be verified by the individual receivers of the message and is therefore weak evidence for God's existence. Paine rejects prophecies and miracles, writing, "It is revelation to the first person only, and hearsay to every other, and consequently they are not obliged to believe it." He also points out that the Christian revelations appear to have altered over time to adjust for changing political circumstances, urging his readers to employ reason rather than to rely on revelation. Paine argues that the only reliable, unchanging and universal evidence of God's existence is the natural world. The Bible of the deist, he contends, should not be a human invention such as the Bible, but rather a divine invention. It should be creation. Paine takes this argument even further, maintaining that the same rules of logic and standards of evidence that govern the analysis of secular texts should be applied to the Bible. In Part 2 of The Age of Reason, he will do just this, pointing out numerous contradictions in the Bible. For example, Thomas Paine notes, "The most extraordinary of all the things called miracles related in the New Testament is that of the devil flying away with Jesus Christ, and carrying him to the top of a high mountain, and to the top of the highest pinnacle of the temple, and showing him and promising to him all the kingdoms of the world. How happened it that he did not discover America? Or is it only with kingdoms that his sooty highness has any interest?" Paine's analysis of the Bible, after establishing that he would refrain from using extra-biblical sources to inform his criticism, but would instead apply the Bible's own words against itself, Paine questions the sacredness of the Bible, analyzing it as one would any other book. For example, in his analysis of the book of Proverbs, he argues that its sayings are inferior in keenness to the proverbs of the Spaniards, and not more wise and economical than those of the American Franklin. Describing the Bible as fabulous mythology, Paine questions whether or not it was revealed to its writers and doubts that the original writers can ever be known. "My intention is to show that those books are spurious, and that Moses is not the author of them, and still further, that they were not written in the time of Moses, nor till several hundred years afterward, that they are no other than an attempted history of the life of Moses, and of the times in which he is said to have lived, and also of the times prior thereto, written by some very ignorant and stupid pretenders to authorship, several hundred years after the death of Moses. The books called the Evangelists, and ascribed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They have been manufactured, as the books of the Old Testament have been, by other persons than those whose names they bear, using methods that would not become common in biblical scholarship until the 19th century. Paine tested the Bible for internal consistency and questioned its historical accuracy, concluding that it was not divinely inspired. Paine also argues that the Old Testament must be false because it depicts a tyrannical God. The history of wickedness pervading the Old Testament convinced Paine that it was simply another set of human-authored myths. He deplores people's credulity. Brought up in habits of superstition, he wrote, people in general know not how much wickedness there is in this pretended word of God. citing Numbers chapter 31 verses 13 to 47 as an example, in which Moses orders the slaughter of thousands of boys and women, and sanctions the rape of thousands of girls at God's behest. Paine calls the Bible a book of lies, wickedness, and blasphemy, for what can be greater blasphemy than to ascribe the wickedness of man to the orders of the Almighty? Religion and the state. Paine also attacks religious institutions, indicting priests for the lust for power and wealth and the Church's opposition to scientific investigation. He presents the history of Christianity as one of corruption and oppression. Paine criticizes the tyrannical actions of the Church as he had those of governments in the rights of man and common sense, stating that the Christian theory is little else than the idolatry of the ancient mythologists, accommodated to the purposes of power and revenue. Quote, "This kind of attack distinguishes Paine's book from other deistic works, which were less interested in challenging social and political hierarchies. He argues that the Church and the state are a single corrupt institution which does not act in the best interests of the people. Both must be radically altered." Soon after I had published the pamphlet Common Sense in America, I saw the exceeding probability that a revolution in the system of government would be followed by a revolution in the system of religion. The adulterous connection of church and state, wherever it has taken place, has so effectually prohibited by pains and penalties every discussion upon established creeds, and upon first principles of religion, that until the system of government should be changed, those subjects could not be brought fairly and openly before the world, but that whenever this should be done, a revolution in the system of religion would follow. Human inventions and priestcraft would be detected, and man would return to the pure, unmixed and unadulterated belief of one God, and no more. As John Mee, a scholar of British radicalism, writes, Paine believed a revolution in religion was the natural corollary, even prerequisite, of a fully successful political revolution. Paine lays out a vision of, in Davidson and Sheikh's words, an age of intellectual freedom, when reason would triumph over superstition, when the natural liberties of humanity would supplant priestcraft and kingship, which were both secondary effects of politically managed foolish legends and religious superstitions. Quote, "It is this vision that scholars have called Paine's secular millennialism, and it appears in all of his works. He ends the rights of man, for example, with the statement, 'From what we now see, nothing of reform in the political world ought to be held improbable. It is an age of revolutions, in which everything may be looked for.'" Paine transformed the millennial Protestant vision of the rule of Christ on earth into a secular image of utopia, emphasizing the possibilities of progress and human perfectibility that could be achieved by humankind without God's aid. Paine's intellectual debts. Although Paine liked to say that he read very little, his writings belie this statement. The Age of Reason has intellectual roots in the traditions of David Hume, Spinoza, and Voltaire, since Hume had already made many of the same moral attacks upon Christianity that Paine popularized in The Age of Reason. Scholars have concluded that Paine probably read Hume's works on religion or had at least heard about them through the Joseph Johnson circle. Paine would have been particularly drawn to Hume's description of religion as a positive source of harm to society that led men to be factious, ambitious and intolerant. More of an influence on Paine than Hume, however, was Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Paine would have been exposed to Spinoza's ideas through the works of other 18th-century deists, most notably Carnew's Middleton. Paine would also more than likely have been familiar with Voltaire's mocking wit and the works of other deistic French philosophers, though these larger philosophical traditions are clear influences on The Age of Reason. Paine owes the greatest intellectual debt to the English deists of the early 18th century, such as Paine.It. John Toland had argued for the use of reason in interpreting Scripture. Matthew Tyndall had argued against revelation. Middleton had described the Bible as mythology and questioned the existence of miracles. Thomas Morgan had disputed the claims of the Old Testament. Thomas Woolston had questioned the believability of miracles, and Thomas Chubb had maintained that Christianity lacked morality. All of these arguments appear in the Age of Reason, albeit less coherently.